called Life Swap. And for me, it's been a series that has helped us become even more intentional about living out our faith, so that following Jesus is not just simply beliefs that we hold on to, but a reality that we begin to live out. And so as we start to do that, what we start to recognize is how God reveals things in our lives that he would like to swap out. And that in order to sometimes remove things such as pride or anger, it's not enough simply to have them removed, but rather God wants to swap in something far greater. Attributes such as humility and forgiveness. And so this has been a series for us, it's been a series for me that hopefully helps us understand, okay, where am I at today? And what is an intentional step that I can take so that I can draw closer and closer to Jesus? Because I think for myself, when I think of my faith and my relationship with God, that it's always about the direction I'm going. And there's only one of two directions. Either I'm going closer to Jesus or I'm stepping further and further away. So hopefully this is a series that helps you in your day-to-day reality of just what does it mean to live out faith with God? And so maybe you're someone here this morning that has not yet even taken that step. And so we hope this is just a helpful opportunity for us again here to say, okay, like what does this start to look like? If you believe in Jesus, what does this look like in my life? And so to help us kind of set the stage a little bit this morning, I want you to think of two people. Okay? Now, not just random two people. There's going to be two categories, and as best as you can, the ground rule is this. You can't tell me who the person is, okay, in fear that I may be one of them. So, it'll make more sense in a moment, right? But don't say who it is. Don't tell the person next to you. But the first person I want you to think of is perhaps it's someone you know or someone you're aware of, just someone that you have come across in life who you would define as being incredibly optimistic. That in the midst of life, they live with a sense of joy, that even in the midst of difficulties, they are always optimistic. They are always a glass half full type of person, right? So, got that person? Hope I don't have to give you too much time to think about that. Got it? Locked in? Nodding of heads helps so I can move on and get you out in time for lunch. Okay, we work together. Okay, so that's the first category. Okay, flip side, I want you to think now of perhaps, maybe not the most, but okay, maybe the most negative person that you know. They are grumpy, they are crotchety. I just want to throw that word in there. I love that word, right? They're just constantly negative about everything. That no matter what happens, there's always something bad that's going to go. If you're to classify this person, you would say they are a cynic. They're skeptical, they're jaded. You don't know why, but they are cynical. Okay? Got that person? Okay, let's not hold on to that person for too long. So one of two people, optimistic or a cynic. Here's the question. Who would you rather be like? Who would you rather be like? Show of hands, who wants to be person number one? That's the optimist, if you're following with me. Okay, I'm looking around to make sure everyone's still tracking. So I'm going to ask the question anyways. Who wants to be option number two? There we go. All right. There we go. Honesty, we're okay with honesty, but it kind of kills my next point, but my thought was that oftentimes we don't want to be the cynic, right? It's not that something we want to become, but maybe the better question is this, is not who do we want to be more like, but rather who are we closer to in terms of our own walk of life? You don't have to raise your hand for this one, but are we closer to that optimist, the person who wants to see the best in life, who wants to see the best in people? Or are we closer to the cynic where because of our past, because of issues, because of circumstances that we are cynical, that we do see life often through a negative lens? Because I think the reality for many of us is that we don't want to be the cynic. I was thinking this past week, I don't know if you remember, but some of it might be longer back, some of it's still about to happen, some is closer. But when you graduated like elementary school or you graduated high school, you have yearbooks. They still do yearbooks? School? Yeah, okay, good. Just tracking with my younger, hipper crew over here, right? All right. So in it, you often have your picture, and then you'd often have a line that says, most likely to become. Right? Do you remember that? You may not remember what was put in your yearbook, but the chances are it was there. I don't remember what was put in mine, but my son, my oldest son, Isaac, just graduated from grade 8. And so they put together this yearbook, and they put all the kids in there, their names, and they put most likely to become. And I found it really interesting to read through the list, because it really identifies, what these kids are passionate about, what they're known for, what their classmates think of them. And for Isaac, it was most likely to become sponsored by Red Bull. Now, Red Bull is that energy drink. They sponsor like extreme sports, and Isaac just loves to mountain bike and do all things. So the classmates thought, most likely to be sponsored. I'm like, I'm all for. If it brings early retirement for the family, let's get on that bandwagon. Here we go. Not that I don't love all of you people, right? But what I didn't notice? Nowhere in there was most likely to become cynical and negative and just down on all of life. It wasn't in there. Like at that age, no one's sitting there thinking, you know what? My goal in life is to be grumpy and negative about everything, right? And sometimes we may think kind of beyond those years. We look back at the younger generations and think, okay, well, they're just so optimistic, because life hasn't really hit them hard as of yet, right? And maybe that thought is going through your mind, because I think it's a good question to ask, is how does it begin to happen? How does cynicism begin to set in? How do you find yourself in the midst of life that your initial response is not being optimistic, but rather thinking, I'm going to guard myself. I'm going to protect myself, because you know that too often life happens. And as I think about my own life, as I think about other people's lives, as we get pulled closer and closer towards this idea of being more cynical in life, I think it often becomes because of 3 Ds that happen in life. The disappointments, the difficulties, and the discouragements. The 3 Ds that happen in the midst of life that oftentimes we have no control over, but often begin to creep into life and begin to suck some of that optimistic spirit out of us. Because we have disappointments in life. People disappoint us, don't they? Maybe you've trusted in someone and they've disappointed you. Someone has made a promise to you and they have disappointed you. Someone has said they will love you and they have disappointed you. Someone has said they will come through for you and they have disappointed you. And so it happens enough over a longer period of time, you step back and you become a little bit more cynical. Or maybe it's not just simply the disappointments, it's the difficulties of life. Right? You face hardship. Someone that you love has become sick, or someone you love has died far too early. You have difficulties, whether they're financial or whether they're situational, whether they're relational. And you have difficulties in life, and so that when you think of a new opportunity, instead of stepping forward, you say, I'm going to just step back. I'm not sure I'm fully going to trust whether people, whether myself, or if we're being honest, even God. And then enter in discouragement. Discouragement because of people, discouragement because of your past, discouragement because of your choices, discouragement because of situations that may have not gone according to plan, like maybe getting overlooked for that promotion yet again, even though you know you deserve it. So you kind of stop trying. You become a little more cynical, a little more jaded and say, what is the point? I pour my heart and my life into this or into this person, and it hasn't worked out yet, so I am done. And suddenly optimism just seems a little bit too far away. And you know the challenge in it all is that most cynics were once optimistic. But it's because their optimism, it's because perhaps their hopes, because their dreams had not worked out according to plan, that they had made the shift. And so how do you know? How do you know in your own life when perhaps you are leaning a little bit closer towards cynicism and getting a little bit further away from optimism? I know in my own life there are two things that begin to happen. One is I begin to project my past into my present. And that can mean any one of the situations. Whether it's in relationships, whether it's in opportunities, whether it's in new steps of faith. I start to think, well, wait a second. This is what happened in the past. It didn't work out then, or this person didn't work out then. And so this is likely what's going to happen in my present or into my future. And so what's the point? And so you stop the train. You don't even let the train get out of the station because you tried that before. And it didn't work out. And you continually project your past onto your present. The second symptom I see starting to develop when I'm kind of wanting to lean into that idea of becoming more cynical is I stop trusting and believing and hoping. That when you're asked to take a new step of faith, maybe God is presenting something new for you in your life, and you're thinking, but I don't know if I can trust you. You know, I tried this before and it didn't quite work out, or there's someone else new in your life, and you think, well, can I really be honest with them? Can I really be open with them? And can I really trust them? But because you've been burned in the past, instead of taking that step of trust and belief and of hope, instead of believing that your future will be different than your past, you stop trusting. You stop believing. You stop hoping. And you see yourself moving closer and closer to the person you thought you never wanted to become. You become more cynical. You become more jaded. You become just more negative when it comes to your outlook in life. Now, this is a reality that I think everyone faces, but when it comes to those of us who desire to follow Jesus, how does it match when Jesus says, I have come to give you the abundant life, the life worth living, and cynicism? How does that mesh together? It doesn't. And as you start to dig a little bit deeper, you start to realize what is at stake. Not only in terms of your relationship with God, but also your relationship or potential relationship with others. Cynicism prevents you from new opportunities, from new experiences with others, new situations that God wants to use you. And so I believe that when Jesus speaks about this abundant life, this life worth living, we need to find a way to push through cynicism, to overcome the difficulties, the disappointments, and the discouragements in life. Because I believe if we're stepping closer to cynicism, we're not only stepping further away from being optimistic, but we're stepping away from the life that God has called us to live. And so what's the response? What do we need in our life to help us swap out cynicism so that we can be filled with this incredible abundance? There's an amazing word that is said over and over and over again in Scripture, and that is the word hope. Hope. It's an amazing word, and it's probably a word that you would have expected me to say. But here's the interesting thing, is the question is not just simply, do you want hope, but rather, what do you place your hope in. So to help us out, we're going to turn back to the passage that was read from 1 Thessalonians. If you have a Bible on your phone or a tablet and you want to swipe there, or you want to just follow along old school in one of the Bibles in front of you, feel free. A bit of a side note, if you don't have a Bible at home and you would like a Bible, we would love to be able to give you a Bible. Either take one of these blue Bibles in the pews, just take it and run. Don't even run, just walk. You can walk because you're not stealing it. You're taking the Bible. Right? Or go to the welcome table. You can grab one over there as well. We want to jump into this passage and just understand that this question of wrestling with cynicism is not a new one, but rather many others have wrestled with it as well. And so just since we jumped in, I'm going to give you a quick kind of overview. It's in the New Testament. It's written about 20 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so the movement of Jesus is beginning to grow. And the way it's growing is this group of Jesus followers are going to other communities and telling them about the incredible hope that is found in Jesus. And one of the main people, one of the main leaders of the early church is a person by the name of Paul, often referred to as the Apostle Paul. He was inspired by God to write much of what we have in the New Testament. So in this particular situation, if you want to hear more about it, you can go back to the book of Acts. Acts chapter 17 actually gives you the framework for this letter. It's a letter, right? We often look at it as a book, but it's a letter, or in our current context, a really long email. But this is what it is. And so Paul had just visited this city in Thessalonica. That's a bit of a mouthful. But think modern day Greece. He had visited there, and he only lasted 3 weeks. He went and he started talking about Jesus in the streets and in the synagogues, but he only lasted 3 weeks. You want to know why? You want to eat lunch? Yeah, okay, good. Keep track with me. The reason he only lasted 3 weeks is the majority of the people in the city of Thessalonica did not want to hear or did not like what Paul had to say. Yes, there was a gathering of people who were plugged in and like, yes, I'm going to follow this. I want Jesus in my life. But the majority of the people thought this was absolutely ridiculous. And they thought it was so ridiculous that they started rioting in the streets, right? Like, think about it. Think of it because of what we're doing here. People start rioting in downtown Paris, right? They wanted nothing to do with it. And it got so bad that after only 3 weeks, Paul had to be smuggled out of Thessalonica in the middle of the night because they thought they were going to end his life. So Paul's there 3 weeks, tells them about Jesus, hightails it out of there, and then it gets even better. Because the riots, the people rioting in the streets can't find Paul, they go and gather all the people who have listened to Paul and have decided to follow Jesus. They round them up and they bring them to city council and say they should be held accountable. You should fine them, you should imprison them, you should do something to them. Right? So that's the scenario. Here's a group of people who had only heard about Jesus for 3 weeks. And the guy who told them about him had hightailed it out. And now, as a result of what they believed because of what he said, they were now facing severe difficulties and persecution in their life. And the question that Paul was asking, and maybe you're asking, is what would they do? Would they continue to believe? Or would they become skeptical and cynical and think this is just another person coming into town, blowing smoke about someone else? Why would we believe in that when it's causing this kind of struggle? And that's, I think, what Paul was thinking. Because what Paul does next is he sends his protege, his second-hand man, because he still can't show his face in that city. He sends a guy by the name of Timothy to go and see what was happening and then come and report back to him. Okay, still tracking with me? A lot of background. This is the point. All of that set the stage for what Paul was now going to write. And so what we see in 1 Thessalonians is Paul's response to the news that Timothy gave to him. And listen to how the letter starts. Paul says, "We always thank God for all of you, mentioning you in our prayers. We continually remember before our God and Father your work produced by faith and your labor prompted by love. Does that sound like the response of a cynic? No. That sounds like there was the reality of how these people were continuing to believe what Paul was saying, that even in the midst of severe persecution, they were still remaining faithful. They were not allowing the difficulties, the disappointments, or the discouragement of life to remove the reality of God and faith from them. And the answer is in this one phrase: their endurance inspired by hope in Jesus Christ. I believe we have a lot to learn from those first followers in Thessalonica. That we see that they were able to endure because they were inspired by hope. And I believe that when we start to look at our life, when we start to look at the realities of difficulties, of disappointments, and of discouragement, the way that we do not allow cynicism to set in is that we continually be inspired by hope. But it's a hope that is not simply wishful thinking. It's a hope that is rooted in the person of Jesus. And as Paul continues on in verse 4, he begins to get real granular with us to help us understand as to what this hope is. Right? Because you probably expect this as a response, right? That, okay, in the midst of difficulties, in the midst of discouragements, what should we do? Okay, we should hope in Jesus. Okay, that is true, but what does it look like? I want to explain two things that I believe our hope is based upon that helps us to be inspired and to endure in the most difficult of moments of life. Whether someone has disappointed you, whether someone has died and you're struggling with that, whether that situation in life that you wanted to become true has fizzled out on you. Here is what we're reminded of, that when we put our hope in Jesus, we're promised at least two things. In verse 4, it says that we are chosen and loved by God. Chosen and loved by God. It means that our hope is based not upon our performance, not upon our outcome, but upon God's relationship with us. That in the midst of the difficulties, in the midst of the discouragements, in the midst of the disappointments of life, we can find hope knowing that we are chosen and we are loved by God. That's the first thing. Then we jump all the way to the end of the passage, and in verse 10, we read this. As Paul's concluding, and he says, "And you are able to wait for Jesus from heaven, whom was raised from the dead, who rescues us." Now, what does that mean? It's the belief, it's the holding on to the fact that God has not done his work yet, that Jesus is going to come again. And it speaks to the greater reality that Christian hope is based not only on the fact that we are loved and chosen by God, but that God has a plan and that God is in control. And for me, in the midst of life, in the midst of the setbacks, in the midst of the disappointments, in the midst of the difficulties, in the midst of the moments that I don't understand and at times I don't even agree with, what maintains my hope in God is the belief that he is in control. The belief that he has a plan. That I step out of the circle of thinking, well, this is just random, or this is just coincidence, and to land in the place of understanding and believing that because of Jesus, because of his life, his death, his resurrection, because of the promise that he's given to us, that we can know that God is in control. And that begins to enable us to continue to trust in him. And so what does it start to look like? I began this morning by saying it's important to understand that faith is not simply just about what we believe, but rather how we live it out. And so I think the first step is to take that initial step to say, Jesus, I am going to commit to you. So that in the midst of life, in the things that I don't have control over, like other people, like the circumstances, like different situations, like the difficulties that come into my life, I don't have control over many of those things, but what I do have control over is the decision to commit and to trust in Jesus. For many of you here this morning, you have made that decision. For others, perhaps you're still wrestling with that and wondering, is this really the answer? One of the great celebrations we have is when we celebrate baptism. When people come forward and say, I have made the choice to put my hope in Jesus. That's a decision you want to make. Would love to follow up and have a conversation with you later in the week. Either drop me an email, my email's in the bulletin, or fill out one of those welcome cards in the pew, leave it at the welcome table, follow up. But it's a chance to say, this is a reality for me, that I'm going to take a step of faith. I am not going to let my past, my own difficulties, my own disappointments, my own discouragements prevent me from this abundant life of trusting in Jesus and saying, I want that as a part of my life. For those of us, myself included, who have made that decision, in many ways, hope is a continual recommitting to Jesus. Because I get it. There's times where I start to slide closer and closer towards cynicism, and I have to stop and remind myself and to refocus upon the importance of the hope of Jesus in my life. And so for the rest of us, there's two things I want you to consider. If you truly want hope to be a reality, two things that have been incredibly helpful and important to me. The first one is get in community. Get around other people who share this same hope in Jesus. There's a famous line. Jim Rohn says it. I think he said it first. But he says, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with, right? So whether or not you believe that saying, basically what he's saying is the people you hang out the most with are going to have an influence upon you. And I think we probably all get that, right? You hang around enough negative people long enough, you start to get negative. Now, I'm not saying you write them off, right? Because they need you in their life. But what it does mean is that we need to be influenced by other people who hold on to the same hope. And there's 2 things that we can do. The first one is doing stuff like this on a Sunday morning, right? Is showing up. This is a good first step. And I know life gets busy, and I know schedules get filled, and there always seems to be other things to do, but maybe this is the fall for you to consider. I'm going to be committed to this. I'm going to make Sunday morning a priority for me and my family. I want to come because this is my commitment to you, that we'll always focus upon Jesus, right? The last thing I want to get into is pop psychology or 5 ways to live a better life. I know one way, and that's following Jesus. And so as we come, the songs we sing, the prayers that are spoken, the hopefully the helpful words that are said, it'll always bring us back to Jesus, because I know that life is busy and life gets complicated, and disappointments and difficulties and discouragement, they don't ask for an appointment in your agenda, do they? They just show up. So what you can do is schedule those times to be reminded of who Jesus is and what he means to you. So would you make Sunday morning a commitment? If you want to dive even deeper, there's an even better next step, and that is to get into small groups, right? As great as this is, it's even better when you get into a smaller group of people who can come alongside and you can chat and you can encourage and you can support each other. In a couple of weeks, we're going to be talking more and more. We have about 15, 16 groups that meet throughout the year, a great way to get plugged in. Maybe you start considering, is this an opportunity to be around other people, to encourage and to support and to remind me that in the midst of life, I'm going to find my hope in Jesus. It's the first thing, get in a community. Second thing I'm going to say is this, write it down. Okay, whatever your difficulty, whatever your discouragement, whatever your disappointment may be, what I found incredibly helpful is to write this stuff down. Some people call it journaling. I don't like to call it journaling. That just doesn't seem to be my thing. But call it journaling, whatever you want to do. Write it down because it does two things. I found it to be incredibly helpful for me. The first thing is it gets specific. You know what cynicism loves to do is to be general. Right? Well, this is not going to work out because nothing ever works out. This person's going to let you down because everybody lets you down. You're never going to, write it down, get specific, because then you can present it to God and you can allow him to work at it in you. That's the first thing that's helpful. It gets specific. The second thing that I found incredibly helpful is it enables you to go back and to look at how God is at work and how God is in control. It may not be the next day. It may not be the next week. It may not be the next month. It may not even be the next year. But what you start to see is a record of how God is working in your life and through your life. This past year, I did just a quick review of the year, both for ministry, both for personal, and I looked at two things. I looked at my journal and I looked at my calendar. And it was amazing to see and to go back and to be taken back into those moments where I was discouraged or I was disappointed or there was a difficulty and I thought, I have no idea how this is going to work out. And in many cases, it didn't even work out the way I thought it was going to, but I saw God at work in the midst of it. And so would you take that step and begin to allow God to be a part of your life? I'm going to invite the music team to come up. They're going to sing a song for us. And what I'm just going to ask you to do is, as they're singing the song, just to think maybe there's a difficulty. Maybe there is a disappointment. Maybe there's a sense of discouragement that has been revealing itself to you. And it can pull you in one of two directions. It can either pull you closer to cynicism, or it can start to draw you closer to Jesus. The choice is yours. But when we choose hope, when we choose faith in Jesus, two things happen. Not only does our faith grow, but it starts to impact those around us. We see this in this passage. People started talking about that little church in Thessalonica because of their tremendous faith that was inspired by hope. The same can be said of you. The same can be said of us when we put our hope in Jesus.